Hey friends, today we're going somewhere different. Not into war, not into politics, but behind the curtains of ancient Rome's most private rooms. What if I told you the real power in Rome wasn't on the battlefield, but on silk couches under candlelight? In whispers no one dared repeat. Yeah, this one's going to stay with you. So before we open that door, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with your country and local time. Fans, stick around, because the deeper we go, the more it starts to make sense, and also gets weirder. In the shadowy candlelit villas of ancient Rome, behind the veils of perfumed incense and the shimmer of golden goblets, a different kind of empire was being built, one not marked by legions and lictors, but by whispered promises, carnal transactions, and silent hierarchies. The image of Roman orgies in popular imagination often flirts with the obscene, fountains of wine, indulgent feasts, naked bodies writhing in ecstasy under marble ceilings. But the truth is far more unsettling and far more human. These were not simply gatherings of pleasure, they were ceremonies of power. To understand the psychology of Rome's ruling elite, one must look beyond the togas and temples, into the spaces they reserved for their most secretive indulgences. Rome, an empire of laws and brutal discipline, paradoxically allowed for indulgence as a method of control. The same society that enforced strict codes of behavior in public gave its rulers a private realm to assert a different kind of dominance through erotic manipulation, ritualized humiliation, and absolute control over the bodies and desires of others. For Rome's elite, these nocturnal banquets were a means to display superiority without drawing a sword. The architecture of a typical elite Roman home tells the story. At the center of the villa was not just the atrium or the tablinum for formal affairs, but also the triclinium, the dining room. It was here, among reclining couches and imported delicacies, that alliances were made and lives were undone. The very layout of Roman domestic space placed indulgence and social ritual side by side. Participation in these gatherings was not open to all. To be invited was to be chosen, not merely to feast but to submit, to witness, to perform. A seat at the table was a currency of favor, a marker that one had either pledged loyalty or would soon be required to. Declining such an invitation was not just rude, it could be politically suicidal. This was no accident. Emperors like Nero and Caligula understood well the power of spectacle. Caligula, especially, turned the orgy into theater, a psychological weapon. His events were legendary not for their hedonism alone, but for the sheer terror they evoked in the attendees. Guests were selected, stripped, not just of clothing but of pride, and ordered into scenes of debasement. Caligula watched with a mixture of fascination and contempt, reinforcing his identity as both god and tormentor. Those who hesitated or resisted often disappeared, sometimes permanently. What we now call an orgy in Rome was, in its truest form, a ritual of social submission. For the most part, the event began as a convivium, a traditional banquet involving food, wine, and entertainment. But by the end of the night, it often transformed into a stage where hierarchy was no longer implied and it was physical. Those reclining nearest to the host were expected to indulge his preferences, laugh at his jokes, and affirm his power, even with their bodies. One of the more insidious aspects of this culture was the use of concubinage, a socially acceptable structure in which powerful men kept lovers, male or female, outside of marriage. These relationships were not built on affection, but on the careful choreography of dominance. A concubine was expected to know their place, their silence a signal of loyalty, their obedience a mirror of the master's glory. At times, these lovers were even paraded during feasts, offered up to impress or intimidate visiting dignitaries. Among Rome's wealthiest patricians, even the slaves who served the feasts were chosen for more than their ability to pour wine. Youthful, attractive, and often foreign, they were walking testaments to Rome's conquest and reach. The very presence of such bodies, compliant, silent, glistening in oil and gold, reminded every guest who held the reins of empire. A cup of spiced wine might be passed by a Thracian boy, a platter of roasted hare by a girl from Gaul. Her eyes downcast, her movements rehearsed. These moments, though muted in marble and mosaic, were charged with unspoken transactions. To lie beside the emperor at a feast was to swear a kind of fealty. To reject an invitation was to risk social exile, or worse. Rome thrived on this duality, the mask of celebration hiding the hand of command. Even the most notorious episodes in Roman history, such as Nero's bizarre public marriage, ceremonies to his slaves, were less about eccentric desire and more about the optics of omnipotence. When Nero married Sporus, a young male slave whom he dressed as an empress, it was not merely shocking, it was revolutionary. He upended every Roman moral expectation to remind the Senate and the people, I decide what is Rome, even love, even gender, even ceremony, fine all bend to my will. Coins minted with Nero's face during these years bore inscriptions that flirted with godhood. His face, slightly tilted, eyes detached, projected a man who had transcended mortal rules. And in a sense he had. His feasts, and what occurred within them, were not judged by senatorial decree or by the people. They were judged only by their effectiveness in enforcing loyalty and fear. The psychology behind these events was not new, nor unique to Nero. Long before him, powerful Roman men had understood that pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure, could be wielded like a gladius. They learned this from observing not only the Greeks, but the Etruscans, and even the Eastern monarchs, whose customs filtered into Roman life as the empire expanded. Pleasure was the great equalizer, but also the great divider. Who was allowed to enjoy it, and who was forced to provide it, became a quiet but lethal game of status. One might imagine these parties as pure chaos, wine pouring, bodies writhing, but much of it was choreographed. The elite knew exactly how to curate the experience. The lighting, the music, the scent of oils, the rhythm of conversation. It was all designed to loosen inhibitions and encourage a kind of fragile honesty. Once disarmed by pleasure, guests became pliable. A suggestion whispered in such a moment could become a vow by morning. A flirtation across the table might birth an alliance that reshaped entire provinces. And beneath it all, control. Control over who was invited. Control over what roles people played. Control over who watched, who touched, who yielded. A senator might offer his wife or daughter to a general during these events, not out of affection, but as a gesture of submission. This was how alliances were made in the shadows, through flesh, not ink. The implications were enormous. These gatherings determined appointments, promotions, marriages, exiles. They marked who rose in the forum and who vanished into the margins of Roman history. The decadence then was not gratuitous, it was strategic, and yet not all guests emerged unscathed. There are stories, whispered in the darker corners of Tacitus and Suetonius, of young men broken by their experience, of senators blackmailed into complicity, of women who arrived at banquets as guests and left as property. These weren't outliers. They were the casualties of a system built on domination disguised as delight. The irony is that Rome, which prided itself on discipline and order, found its most primal chaos within its palatial walls. The same hands that signed edicts and led armies also reached across silk, cushions to claim bodies that could neither resist nor refuse. So when we imagine the Roman orgy, the grapes, the laughter, the abandon, we are not wrong, but we are only seeing half the truth. The other half lies in the eyes of the host, the weight of the invitation, the silence of the slaves, and the ripple of consequences that followed each sigh and moan behind closed doors. In Rome, pleasure was never just about pleasure. It was a language, a weapon, a kingdom of flesh ruled by the few, endured by the many. And in that kingdom, to touch was to command, to obey was to survive, and to indulge, with eyes open, was to understand the true nature of Roman power. Thanks for watching. And remember, the past wasn't just battles and empires. It was manipulation, mystery, and madness. If you still haven't subscribed, tonight's the time. There's so much more they never told us. Trust me, what's coming next? You won't want to miss it.